Good morning, my story lovers. Here we are. It's Take Back Your Life Masterclass, part 2. We are going to be digging in today to the idea of self-compassion, and in particular, how self-compassion really helps us to transform and really transcend the stories that we've been telling ourselves about us. So, what are those stories? What stories are we telling ourselves? We talked a little bit yesterday about uncovering what those stories are. So, if you missed that masterclass, feel free to head to learntoloveyourstory.com/masterclass. And I am listing all of them there. So, after each and every masterclass this week, I'll be putting them there. They'll be up there until January 31st. They're also, though, in the Take Back Your Life Masterclass group in the guides. So you can always go back there. So talked yesterday about how to figure out what are these stories, like the real stories, the stories behind the stories that drive why we do what we do when we do it. And now today we're going to really dig into talking about having a self-compassionate lens when we figure all that stuff out, if we want to transcend and change those stories. Otherwise, we're just noticing it, getting real self-critical, little inner mean girl, not even little, like mine is a big girl, and she mean. They come out, and then we just kind of repeat the cycle. We want to avoid our self-critical thinking. We want to double down on our old patterns and try again. And yet we end up in the same spot, right? So to get started, I'm going to make sure that I've pulled up the comments. Remember that at any time when I do my lives, if you have any questions, please let me know. I do try to watch for them here, but I don't get to answer them on the thing that's recording me. So if you see me look down, I'm just looking for those comments from us. So let me get that started here. All right, I think I got that pulled out. So comment away. I want to hear from you what it is that's resonating with you from our talk today, what it is that you have questions about with self-compassion. This idea is not unique. Like anybody that does, any mindfulness or meditation work or yoga, any of those Eastern philosophies has heard loving kindness meditations, has heard about this concept of having compassion towards yourself and towards others. How to put that into action, though, whole different thing. How to put into action this idea of having a compassionate lens for you when you make mistakes. That's hard. Not only is it hard, but it is literally the stopping point when you have noticed a pattern in your life that you're real frustrated with. So why am I always making this mistake over and over? I'll hear across the couch. Thousands of hours, people, I've sat across the couch. I've heard that a bazillion times. I've said it to myself a bazillion times, and I'm sure you've said it to yourself a bazillion times. But we get super frustrated when we notice like we're in that same position again. And like the common denominator is not the million guys you dated or the million jobs you lost or the million opportunities in employment that you missed. No, the common denominator is you. And so we get real self-critical at that point. And I want you to know that's a pretty natural thing, like literally how our brain is wired, which we'll get into a little bit today. So you're not alone in how your self-critical thinking shows up. But what happens at that point is our mind doesn't like the criticalness of it. Our mind sees that as an internal threat, so we're threatening ourselves by being mean. And when we're threatened, we double down in old patterns and keep repeating the cycle, rather than freeing ourselves up into a curious lens, a lens of non-judgment that compassion allows for us, and being able to see this differently and show up to it differently, like choose a different path maybe the next time. Not the right path maybe yet, but a different path, and we'll try that, and then we'll try something else, and then we'll try something else until we can finally really get rid of that old pattern. So tell me in the comments as you're listening through this, is there any questions that you have? Are there any places where this really shows up for you? Because if it's showing up for you, I'd be happy to speak to your stories specifically. Of course, we're here I'm the one talking. So I'll be sharing from my own examples so that you can kind of put this rubber to the road with this idea, this concept. So yesterday we talked a lot about, one of the stories behind the stories that I found out in my career. Today, I think we'll switch over to more of a personal life kind of a thing. So first, let me ask you, are you a people pleaser? Are ya? Do you find yourself like saying the yes to the things? We talked about that a little bit yesterday, but saying yes to the things, but in service to not upsetting anybody in your life, not creating any kind of conflict in your life. Am I right? Yeah, there's a lot of us that struggle with this place, especially women in midlife. We are really conditioned to be the ones that are doing all the things and taking care of all the things in our families and communities and in our workplaces. And we really have a hard time when we find out that something we did was not the right thing. And when we figure that out, what's the first place we go? Negative self-talk. It's pretty natural posture. We get real mean with ourselves about the fact that we have done something wrong, that we haven't, pleased everybody. And we will fixate for hours on end, for days at a time, on the one thing that we didn't do well. And we give little mind to the million of little things that we do along the way that we do really well. And this is actually how our brain is programmed. I know that sounds real weird, but gratefulness, it's not a natural thing. It is not our natural state of mind. It's why we have to make it a practice. Instead, our natural state of mind is to correct things in our environment that aren't going well, to make our environment as easy and as fluid and efficient as it possibly can. That is how the brain has developed over time. That's how it's survived in the wild. That's how it's surviving in the wild of Western culture at this point. And so when we're not pleasing others, and that is a story that really drives who we are as a person in this world, we get super self-critical when that gets identified. So let me tell you a little story about myself and where this came up and why compassion was such a key point of how I was going to pivot and change how I showed up to this. All right. So, second divorce, not a great time in my life. I am super busy at that time because, of course, I'm moving and, finding a new place. That's always a really difficult time. I'm divorcing. That's a super huge life transition. My son, who at the time was about 15, was deciding not to live with me full time and to go and live with his dad full time for high school. That was a huge transition for me. And just to add a little sprinkle on to the top of that, that was the time when I decided I was going to go out on my own and start a private practice. So moving from that group practice I referred to yesterday into my own, throwing up my shingle and having my own private practice. That is a shit ton of stuff that I was doing all at one time. And I know you've had these moments in your life where like you just couldn't control some of those factors, but maybe some of those factors you could have changed. Like, was that the most opportune time for me to run into doing my own thing, throwing out my own shingle? Maybe not. I understand now, with my understanding better, my stories behind my stories, why I was doing that. Overworking is my drug of choice. Like when life is really difficult for me, I don't hit alcohol, I don't hit overeating, I don't hit the gym. I wish maybe that would have been more helpful for me. Instead, I overwork. I really throw myself into work. I really throw myself into being busy a lot of the time so that I'm not here in the moment where all the stress is happening. And I know that, we all have our version of that. So this was mine, and that was my drug of choice at the time, was to open up my own private practice. It really, my mind was always on it. It was on little details like furniture and making sure that I had a place to be and practice in. It was on, setting up the business, all the things, right? So really, really busy time in my life. And I was really struggling with the fact that my son had moved in with his dad at that juncture. wasn't that he had done it. We had been talking about this for years prior to him doing this. It was something that he had kind of wanted to do, is like, I'll live with you through middle school, and then in high school, I think I'll move in with dad and spend a few years, you know, living with dad instead. Okay. Totally had been something that he and his dad and I had been talking about. So shouldn't have, right? I'd already gone to therapy, people. I'd already been in therapy, thought I had taken care of that, right? I had talked to my therapist about this, maybe, you know, for a year ahead of that happening. What I didn't know was that I was going to be, what I didn't know is that what I was going to be doing at the same time was opening up a new practice and being busy and divorcing and all the things that were happening to me at that time. So clearly, first of all, in any life transition, even when you know it's coming, it doesn't make the blow easier. You know, empty nesting is not an easy thing to do, even though we know our 18-year-olds or whatever are going to be leaving the house. That's not an easy thing. So even if you've been preparing, it never prepares you quite for the loss. It's the same with, you know, loss of somebody to a terminal illness or something that you know is coming. You do a lot of the work ahead of time, but you can't know what that big hole in your life is going to feel like until it shows up. That's pretty natural. And that's what had happened to me, except that I was also under a lot of duress that I hadn't anticipated. So the skills that I thought I was going to put into practice when he moved in with his dad, I was not putting into practice. I had wanted to make sure that I was contacting him all the time, that I was being a part of his little life all the time. And you know, I was trying to adjust to this new, I'm a weekend parent kind of a thing, which you're not even really when you have a teenager. You're not even really when you have a teenager and they live in your same house. So let's be real. But yeah, they have a lot of things. They're doing the things. They're in high school. They have friends. They have, you know, activities. They're not hanging out with their parents. And so I had all these ideas of how I was going to do that. All of them went out the window. Why? Because I was so intensely focused on starting my new business, which was a real escape from what was happening to me elsewhere in my life. There was a period of time where I went for about 2 weeks. We just talked about this again, and he thinks it's 10 days, but I thought it was 2 weeks. It's a 4-day difference, but there's about 2 weeks where I didn't talk to him, not texting him, not checking in with him, not calling him, not seeing him in any way at all. What? I can't tell you how upset I was when I figured this out. And here's how I figured this out. It was a Saturday afternoon. I took him to lunch, breakfast. We were going to go to a swim meet, I think, later. And I'm sitting across him in Perkins, and he goes, "So Mom, what's up?" And I'm like, "What do you mean? What do you mean, what's up?" "Well, like, you haven't even texted me in like 2 weeks." And he shows me his phone, and I'm like, oh, I wanted the earth to suck me up at that point. You know, I pride myself on being a pretty decent parent, but I had known how to be a decent parent as a parent who was the full-time parent where the kid lived with you. I didn't know how to do this in 2 separate households, and to be starting that during a time under such stress, the inevitability of something like this was like huge. It was just inevitable that I was going to mess it up in some capacity because I was under duress, and I you know, had no blueprint for how this should look going well, and I wasn't doing well. Now, that isn't any of what I'm thinking to myself in the moment. In the moment, I'm thinking, you are the worst mother ever. How could you have allowed this to happen? How this poor child who is so amazing, how is it even possible that he has a mom that's this bad? I mean, this is the kind of thing that I'm doing to myself when I catch that. I was really, really wrecked by the fact that I had let that amount of time go without even thinking to text him in the midst of it. Now, I could have sat in that negative spiral for years if I had, like, seriously, had I not stopped it with some self-compassion. And it took me a bit to get there. Like, it wasn't like, oh, and now I'm going to be self-compassionate about it. and I know about this stuff and I teach about this stuff. I've been doing it for years. Most of what I do in Learn to Love Your Story comes not only, from my personal life stuff and experience, but my professional life. For 2 decades, I've been a clinical psychologist. This is not a unique thing that I teach to people that I see in my office or now in my virtual office. I couldn't believe that I had done it, and I was not showing up to that with self-compassion right away. I was getting into that self-critical thinking. What an awful, worst mom ever kind of thing that you just did. And it undermines all of what you do as a parent now. So I knew this was happening. I could see it happening. And here is a phenomenon that happens between self-awareness and self-compassion. In the change process, sometimes we have to walk down that same road a few times and fall into the same hole a few more times and be aware that it's happening while it's happening to collect enough information to make change, to affect change at that point. That's a tough one, right? So I knew I was smack in that. I could see that I had done it. I could see how I had done it. I was collecting that information, but I was still being very self-critical about it. And the problem with that, as I said earlier, is if you stay too self-critical in those moments, what will happen is you'll want to avoid your own self-critical thinking. So you will dive deep into old patterns. You'll double down in your old patterns, right? And for me, my old pattern was to overwork. It was going to be real easy for me to get lost in my work again and forget this and forget my self-critical thoughts about it and just avoid it altogether by overworking again. So I was trying to hold on to not getting back into that and to figuring out how is it possible that I had done this to my little boy. I mean, he was only 15 at the time. Just not cool, not cool. So here's how I ended up being able to do that for myself. I had this moment where, during that time in my life, let's see, I was in midlife. I was going through major life transitions. Sleep sucked. And this is a pretty normal phenomena too. Like I'd wake up many times in the middle of the night. I just had, kind of this little bout with insomnia during that life transition, which is not uncommon for you if that's something that you've experienced. And I woke up in the middle of the night just in tears. I have no idea what I was actually dreaming at the time. Like that, I don't remember. But what I do know is that I woke up with this overwhelming sense that I needed to forgive that part of me that had done this. I needed to forgive that mom that was under duress, that she wouldn't have been able to see this. She was in the moment just trying to survive because it really was survival mode for me during that time. Now, it wasn't life or death threat, but it felt a lot like that to me at that moment. And so I had to forgive her because if I didn't let go of that narrative of you're the worst mom ever was going to become a new story behind the story that drove behaviors that were not going to be helpful to him, to my daughter who is, living with me and little and is going to be with me for a hot second more. Like I needed to get my shit together, so to speak. So I started to forgive that younger mother. And over time, when I showed up in that curiosity and compassionate lens of, I can see how a version of me did that. So I gave myself just a little distance. It wasn't anymore just the I statements of I am the worst mom ever, but like this version of me, not great. And I, from this vantage point, who's doing a little bit better and sees it now, can forgive that version of me over there. I really was able to kind of get my feet underneath me again and get a better system in place for, let's take care of this relationship with one another. Let's start again. Let's figure out how we're going to do this in 2 separate households, because 2 weeks or 10 days or whatever it is, not okay on any wavelength at all. So why do I tell you this story? This is a really great example of where self-compassion is key to creating any kind of change. Had I stayed in that state of mind of self-critical thinking, I would have slipped back into overworking and giving into probably even a new story behind the story. So the story behind the story first was I have to work and avoid being in the present moment because everything here is too much for me to take. Okay, right? And then I was going to have to, delve into some belief about my parenting being just the worst ever. So that wasn't going to help anybody either. So I had to show up in self-compassion. I really had to forgive and have compassion for that version of me, to open up my eyes in a more non-judgmental way to how am I still participating in my suffering here? Because there was things I was doing that were interfering with my ability to be checking in with him all the time. Like it wasn't built into my regular day. It was when he lived in my house, knock, knock, knock on his door next to mine on the way to bed in the evening, or, have you gotten up for school? But it wasn't built into my day when we were in two separate households. So I was going to have to look at things like that, and I wouldn't have been able to stand it if during that time I was just haranguing myself with negative self-talk, right? So self-compassion is the key here. And I call this compassionate self-awareness. So it really takes what we talked about yesterday in our first talk on self-awareness, looking at what are the real stories, like the story behind the story that makes me participate in these old patterns, or this, keep making the same mistake over and over. Compassion, though, is the lens that we look at it through that's different. Instead of being self-critical, I'm going to fix this, suck, bleh, which actually drives us back into old patterns, we're looking at it from the lens of everybody makes mistakes. Everybody is human here. And if I show up in a kind and understanding way, not a way that accepts what I did, not a way that, accept maybe, but doesn't permit that it was an okay thing to do, accepts that it is what it is and I'm going to move from it, yes. But not, saying, yeah, that was totally okay to be a jackass mom and not text your kid for 2 weeks at a time. But to allow space for kindness and understanding, that's the pivot point right there. So I talk a lot about, as a life transition expert, one of the skill sets that I'm really trying to help people with is a pivoting skill set. Listen, you're never going to stop change from coming your way, ever. It's part of the contract. Death, change. These are parts of the human contract. There's not a lot that's like written in stone, but those two, for sure. You do not stay static in one spot. You are a river and not a rock. And so as a river, you're always the same river, but you're always collecting sediment and always moving downstream and pulling things with you. You're always changing the way that the banks of the river look. You're always contesting with what's happening in your environment, like weather. These are the ways in which we stay a dynamic being, but the same dynamic being, right? It's a paradox in a lot of ways. I'm always Natalie, and I'll always be a Natalie in this world. And I am never the same Natalie. I'm not the same Natalie I was yesterday when I was teaching you about self-awareness, and I'm not the same Natalie today as I teach you about self-compassion. And who I was as a mom going through a divorce and under the duress of moving and having her son move out of her household into his dad's household and changing all that, I couldn't have done any better than I did at the time with what I had. I just didn't have enough to stay on top of it. So what I wanted to do is show up with kindness and understanding towards that so that I could poise myself to have enough going forward. Does that make sense? I want to hear in the comments kind of what you're thinking as you hear this story. Do you hear a part of your story in that story? And remember, I'm going to watch the comments through the whole lecture. So if you're here with me live, I can answer questions or I can speak to any of your unique experiences if you want to have me kind of flesh this out a little bit more. But I want to hear what you think. Like, does this story make sense? It would be easy for a version of me to have gone back into that self-critical thinking and stayed stagnant in a place where I was likely to step all over my parenting and do a bad mom moment yet again. And I didn't save myself by being self-compassionate from ever doing anything wrong as a parent again. Sure, I did one yesterday and we'll do one again today. That's just normal. But having that kindness and understanding towards myself allowed me the opportunity to pivot, right? just gave that whole situation a little bit of a turn so that I could show up differently and be a better mom going forward in my life. One of my favorite quotes ever, one of the quotes I use all the time, but that really encapsulates this entire concept, is by Maya Angelou. Dr. Maya Angelou has this quote about, we do the best we can until we know better. And when we know better, we do better. And that is really the premise behind this. So in life transition, the best skill I can give you is to be able to pivot, because I can't change your circumstances. I can't rewrite your history. I can't make you not make mistakes into the future. You're a fallible being. But I can give you this pivoting skill of compassionate self-awareness so that when you become better at knowing something, you can do better into your future. And you can keep pivoting in that capacity so that you're always showing up in your life in a way that you feel is the best you can at any given moment. Truth be told, you are always showing up the best you can at any given moment. That is kind of what the quote is saying. But when we don't afford ourselves that view of the world, we get super self-critical, which is how we're biologically wired. And then we're off to the races, doubling down in an old behavior, repeating an old pattern that does not serve us any longer, right? All right. So let's talk about, how do I teach self-compassion? There's really 4 areas that we go over in my online course and in group coaching. And I put them in a certain order, right? So first we've started with self-awareness, and we start again kind of in the realm of how do you become self-compassionate? Well, you have to have some awareness. We have to start there. So if you haven't built any awareness skills, if you're really kind of walking around in your world without curiosity, but with judgment, you're not going to do well with this skill. So I talk about how curiosity is really a non-judgmental stance of looking at your world. You're just curious. You're just walking around trying to pick up data that might be useful for future you, right? I'm doing what I can in this moment in my life, and I'm always curious, is this working or not working? How is it working or not working? What could I keep? What could I change? Because listen, that's not working, so I'm going to change that. But this is working, so I'm going to keep it and keep going forward, right? Makes sense? All right, so curiosity is really how I teach having that level of awareness. If you need a little more help with that, go to my self-awareness masterclass. You can learn a little bit more about ways in which I help you to be able to do that. So that's where we start in becoming self-aware or becoming self-compassionate. But what I really go to is the 3 principles that kind of the mother of self-compassion work talks about. And her name is Dr. Kristen Neff, and she has done 20 years of research on this subject and how it really could be a superpower and change life considerably. She has 3 areas that she goes over. Mindfulness, we talked about that yesterday. So you have to stay curious and understand where things are happening. Kindness, and then the sense that we are all human, like we're all fallible beings. So she puts those 3 together, talks about them in her work. She has a great book on self-compassion that just came out called Fierce Self-Compassion, but she has one before that that is just how to be self-compassionate, or how to harness the power of being kind to oneself. I strongly encourage either of those, but probably the first one is the easiest, because it's, the intro, and then she really expands on that subject in her second one on Fierce Self-Compassion, which talks about more of those. Self-compassion is funny, because self-compassion, I think people get this idea is this warm fuzzy thing. Nope, it is not a warm fuzzy thing. Self-compassion is one of the hardest skills that I've taught as a therapist in 20 years. Like, effort hard. So if you wanted to, find the comparable in, say, physical training, stretching that self-awareness, like conditioning that self-awareness, bench pressing, leg pressing, large amounts of weight, that's self-compassion. it's a tough job. The concept isn't hard. Like, you know, the concept of bench pressing isn't hard to wrap my mind around, but my body, what? You know, stretching isn't hard. Yoga positions, like balancing all of my weight on two of my arms. Are you kidding me? No, my body does not do that. And so I just want you to hear how difficult, how effortful, how challenging it is to really implement this particular skill, because it is not the warm, fuzzy kind of idea that we get when we hear the word compassion or self-compassion. We think it's warm fuzzies. It's not. It's not toxic positivity. It is not spinning everything in a positive light. It's a very reality-based strategy. It's really paradoxical in a way, right? It's loving yourself, like, to use my story, loving that young, you know, not young. I wish I was young when I went through my second divorce, not so much, but that mother that made poor choices early on and didn't talk to her kid for 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever it is, right? Like, having love for such a mistake, such an egregious mistake, is a really difficult thing to do. That is not me having warm fuzzies. That is me when I really want to just berate myself with bad words, saying, and I love you. Like, I get why you did this. That's a hard thing to do. It's a super hard thing to do. So I just want to be clear. Like, I think people get that idea of this. That is not what this is. It is very reality-based. Kindness is being clear and authentic, not nice. Very different things. Nice is, oh, well, I'm so sorry that you did that, Natalie, to your kid. I think, you know, you just were going through a hard time. That's nice. That's not helpful. Kindness is, that was a shit-ass thing that you did, and I get why. I understand what you were going through and how you found yourself in that position. And I know you want to do better. The and is the important thing. So paradox is really holding two seemingly opposite things at the same time, right? I suck at what I did to him for that 2-week period, and I'm a good mom, and I want to do better by my kid. Ugh, that's a hard thing to swallow, right? So Dr. Neff really helps us to understand you have to really implement these 3 areas: being kind to yourself, being mindful of what's happening, and understanding, like, we're all a bunch of messed up people in this world, all of us. And that's why her stuff is so powerful. So I get into those 3 areas in my online course and in group coaching. We really kind of pull apart, where are the barriers for you in being kind? Where are the barriers for you in showing up for yourself in a way that you would be able to pivot and change, rather than showing up to yourself in the way that you're wired to? So let's talk about, why are we wired to do that, right? So in my self-awareness course, I talk about the autonomic nervous system, and it kind of gets brought up in my self-compassion courses and in group coaching. This is why I think it is so important to kind of start with those fundamentals. Remember, when I talked to you yesterday about the autonomic nervous system, what we said was this vagal nervous system that is where it like comes down the brainstem, goes into our gut, and our viscera is what we call it. So it's our like chest and gut area. It's your gut brain. It is your intuition, I think, is kind of how we talk about it in a pop culture-y way. This is the part of you that goes into fight or flight if you see a threat, or plays dead and dissociates if your threat is something that you really can't address. And so you have to lie dead in the lion's mouth until she lets you down and goes to get her friends so that maybe you could shake awake and still escape. And this is kind of that idea of overworking and numbing out. That's where you're trying to play dead in your life. I don't want to see that I did this to my kids, so I'm just going to work a lot more, and then I won't see it. So I go back to talking about, what's this autonomic nervous system response? Why is it that we do those things? Why do I double down in avoiding looking at what I did wrong? Why do I show up with self-critical thinking? That's sympathetic. That's fight or flight. That's the first response. I'm mobilized for change. I get super mad at myself and I fight myself on what in the F did you do and why are you doing that, and change that. But when I figure out that I can be as mean to myself as I possibly want and I can't rewrite history, I can't rewrite that this actually went down in my life, then I want to avoid and dissociate and go away from it. That's when you double down on those old behaviors that kind of distract you from the present, and the admitting to yourself that this actually happened. The admitting to yourself just makes you get mad. The madness just shows you there's nothing you can do to change your history, and then you go back and you double down, right? That's a natural wiring that we have. That is literally how our biological set point is. We do not biologically go to, let's be kind. We do, though, when it's other people. So let's think about that for a second. It's easy to be kind, right, to the people in your life that do you wrong when you really love them. So I want you to think about that for a second. You can even tell me in the comments. And you think of a time when you were wronged by somebody in your life that was going through a really difficult thing, or you could understand, you could empathize with why they did what they did when they did it. Just bring, call up an image of that for a minute. Okay. So having that image in your head, I want you to think about what's your initial response when you got wronged. For most of us, it's to be really pissed about it. Maybe you're resentful, maybe even got in an argument with the person about it. Okay. Now, when we get to that point where we realize the relationship to us has more value than fighting it off because we can't rewrite history, what do we do next? Think about that. Reparation is usually where we try to go. Now, we may want them to come to us first, right? We may wait for them to come to us. But the intention behind that, if it's a really significant relationship for us, is that we want to repair it. We want to move on from it. Now, this is a different posture than what I just talked about with my own example. In my example, when I figure out I can't rewrite history, I want to run away from that shit. In this example, if you don't have a powerful relationship, you may want to run away from that or fight them and just move on. But if this is like a spouse, a kid, a best friend, a family member that you care about and want to see at Christmas, not one that you are like, oh, I want Uncle Joe, God, no. But if this is an important relationship to you, you're going to want to repair that. You're going to want to find reparation. You may want them to step in first, but you still, in your mind, want to find reparation. So you've now, this polyvagal nervous system initially wants to fight and, figure out a way to push that away. But when your frontal lobe turns online because your polyvagal nervous system says, hey, this is somebody that I want to tend and befriend to. This is somebody that I really love and enjoy in my life and want to keep in my life. So while I can't rewrite history, I want to repair present moment and going into the future, poise myself to go into the future. That's a really different set point, right? But it's not the wiring we have when we think about ourselves. It's the wiring we have when we think about others. So I talk about this in the very initial stages of my coaching and online coaching because I think it's important to understand this is not because you lack the ability to be compassionate. It's because you have not reinforced that action in your sense of self, in your actions towards self. So we have to help cross-wire that. And neurons that fire together wire together. So what we do is we talk in ways like I did earlier today. I can have compassion towards the mother that did that to her son. I have a hard time saying, Natalie, I forgive you. I forgive me. But I can forgive the mother that went through a divorce and had that 2-week period where she didn't talk to her kid. So I'm engaging that tend, befriend network in my polyvagal mind brain. And I am also engaging my sense of self at the same time. Now I'm going to cross wire that stuff together. So this is the beauty of some of the stuff that I teach. This is not new skills necessarily that I need to teach you to do, but it's new ways in which I'm helping you to reconnect things you already know how to do with what's happening in your life presently, right? Okay. So we start there. Like, this is your natural thing, is to get self-critical. Get the fuck over that. Get over that. Don't worry. Like, that's normal. Don't judge your judging now, because that sends you down a whole other pike of things you got to unravel yourself from to come back. Just know that that's normal. And then the pivot is, let's engage that tend and befriend, compassionate nervous system response that we would have in relationship to people that we care a great deal about, right? Okay, that's where we start. And then we get into kindness towards the self, right? Kindness and niceness are so funny. Kindness is not niceness. Kindness is clarity. Kindness is telling somebody something like it is. Niceness is telling somebody something they want to hear. That's the difference. So I'm going to say that again. Kindness is telling someone like it is. Niceness is telling someone what they want to hear. So if what you want to hear in a moment when you catch yourself being the worst mom ever is, oh, no, you're a great mom, you're a great mom, you're a great mom, and you think that's what compassion is, throw that away. That is not what compassion is. That's being nice to yourself. You don't need to be nice to yourself. You need to be compassionate. You have to, with heart, which is what compassion, the derivatives of those words mean. It means with heart, show up for yourself. Yeah, you did a hard thing. Yeah, you did something wrong. What were you thinking? And you are a good mom. Paradox. That's being kind. That's just naming what is real. And that is why compassion is not positivity. Because sometimes what you're saying to yourself are the things you don't want to hear, but you need to hear. Okay? But you're doing it from the posture of being really empathic towards yourself and wanting yourself to be able to pivot and change from that. So you're not trying to be more difficult with yourself, just reality based with yourself, so that you have a chance to choose different at that point. If you become hard on yourself, then you set up a new flare in the system. There's a new threat of Natalie's being mean to Natalie, and Natalie wants to get away from that. And then you get away not only from your being self-critical, but you go, for me, numbed out and overworked. You're going to put yourself right back in the position of doing the same thing. I'll find another 10-day period where I don't talk to my kid, or a 2-week period where I don't talk to my kid. Not okay. Not what you want, right? All right. So kindness is honesty. That's the best way that I can describe it. And then knowing that we're all human is really a very important piece to this. You would not expect other people not to ever do anything wrong in your life, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I have no friends that haven't wronged me in some way at some point. Some small, some big, some somewhere in between. I have no family members that are perfect. Nope, doesn't happen. None of us are going to get out of this world without making mistakes. I don't even think you can make it 5 minutes in this world without making mistakes. So why in the actual hell are we expecting ourselves to show up that way? Right? You aren't perfect. You aren't here to be perfect. You are here to be human. And if you let others in your life be human, I believe me, you've got the capacity within your brain and nervous system to let you be human too. Now, that is not a permission slip to be an asshole. Like, that's a different thing altogether. That is just reality. That is just how life is. We are all human. We are going to make mistakes. And if we come to the world with, I could make a mistake here, but my desire, my intention is to do it well, then that's where you're going to have the zhuzh in your life that's compassionate. When you show up and you don't do it well, you're just curious about what didn't go well. What went well, what didn't go well, what do I keep doing, what do I do differently? That's a different posture than I'm going to catch myself doing something wrong and beat myself to death, which is how we get with that negative self-talk and that critical thinking. And the higher the stakes of our mistake, the more likely we're going to show up in that veracity of really high self-critical thinking. Now, remember, we're just going to acknowledge that as part of our wiring. Notice that, turn your mind, back to these compassionate techniques, right? But essentially, when we're talking about this, I'll go into my online course and in my on my group coaching, telling our stories. The story I just shared, for instance. I bet there's a lot of you out there this resonates with. Now, maybe you're not such a jerk that you went for 2 weeks without talking to your kid. You know, that was a bold move on my part to be that much of a jerk. So there we are. But I'm going to be compassionate because I get why I was there. But I bet that you heard something in my story that felt like your story, right? The reason I describe these concepts in story is this very reason. We are all human. We are all going to be doing these same kinds of things in our lives. We've all been programmed socially in the same capacities, our families, our history. It's all common, right? Carl Jung, who is one of the fathers of psychology, clinical psychology, he talked about it as the collective unconscious. I mean, that seems like a kind of a woo-woo word. So let's describe what he means. What he meant was we all have some common stories, social programming that we all follow. And we're going to talk more about that tomorrow when we talk about the stories that others tell us and why those impact our lives so much and how you can really transcend those and not get caught up and bogged down in what those stories tell you about you, especially when it doesn't serve you anymore. Maybe it did, but it doesn't now. So that's what we're going to go into in detail tomorrow. But Carl Jung talked to us about this idea that like we all have some common themes. Now, he named some of those archetypes, if you've ever heard those. And so it like essentially was like these, they're archetypes, like they were these standard definitions or constructs that you see consistently across different people. So this idea of toxic masculinity, if you want to go into Carl Jung stuff, you'll start to see that there was an archetype around that hero and around that, ooh, we gotta be the strongest and the like there are archetypes that that's what he called them, but there are these common constructs that people wrap themselves around. They're our common story. And when we have some sort of tear in the fabric of those archetypes or in those common stories, like we did something wrong, we get hard on ourselves. It sets off that fight, flight, freeze system. And here is why. Let's just go back in history a few millennia. If you were on the Serengeti with your tribe and you kept breaking code of one of these constructs, like you're supposed to be the hunter, but you just sit around and are lazy and let other people do your work, people would ostracize you. And if they ostracized you, you might be out of the tribe. And if you're out of the tribe, you're out on the Serengeti all by your lonesome, and that lion gonna get you. Like that's what's gonna happen if you are ostracized by your tribe, right? So this is a common wiring for us to get self-critical because across millennia, we have been conditioned, like survival of the fittest, to want to get along with our peers, to want to stay in community with our tribe and not piss people off or go off code or go outside our constructs or these archetypes, or we would be dead, quite literally dead. It was a threat. It was a reason why you would go into fight or flight. Now, over time, it doesn't make any sense anymore. Like there's not lions out there. It's, it's other moms that are going to judge me because I went for 2 weeks without texting my kid who didn't live with me anymore. Well, like, is that going to kill me? No. But socially, might it kill some of my relationships? Yes. So you see why that fight, flight, freeze system goes off. And this is why we anchor most of what we talk about in self-compassion in our body, mind, neurology. Because I think it's really helpful for you to know that it normalizes a lot of this experience for you, right? But we talk about stories as we talk about our common humanity because how we talk to each other is in our stories. How we understand one another is in our stories. How we repair things for one another is in our stories. I want you to think about the last fight you had with your partner or your spouse or, somebody that you're close to. Like when you finally, wrestled it all out, you told them about your perspective. They told you about your perspective. How did you talk about that? In story. Well, here's the deal. Here's the backstory. I was doing da 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 da, and this went bad because. And they say, well, when you come home at me like da 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 da, then I go to this place where I think da 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 da, right? Story is a really powerful tool to understand, to pivot with, and to heal, right? Like that is how we talk to people. This is how we relate to one another, is in our own stories. If you see somebody online selling something, they're not selling you a product, they're selling you a story. This is how marketing works. You see the runner in the Nikes doing her thing, and you're like, that is me, and I'm going to go buy those shoes, and I'm going to look like that. And then it doesn't happen, and you get mad, and that's a whole different story. But they're selling you a story. They're not selling you a product, right? So how we work and move around in the world is through story. And I end self-compassion really helping you understand that that is how this tool works its charm, works its magic for you, is when you're able to look at it through that lens of story. All right. So tomorrow we will pick up talking more about other people's stories and how those stories really influence us, and how sometimes they no longer serve us. And we really need to learn how to transcend and choose different stories for ourselves to live by. All right. Thank you so much for joining me on your Saturday. This is the first time I've done a master course through the weekend. I'd love to hear from you if that was something that was helpful to you to have, Saturday morning. I'll just sit with my coffee, listen a little to Dr. Natalie wax eloquently about self-compassion. I'd like to know, because I do this at night sometimes, I do them in the mornings, I do them now on weekends, and I just want to know kind of where my followers are at with what they want, because I'm always trying to give you this information in the best way possible. And remember, these are free. So if anything I said today was something that somebody in your life really could use, could hear, like really needs to hear, then please like these things, share them, follow me on my social media so that they get exposure to the kind of stuff that I'm teaching about. I put out new stuff every single week. The master classes happen every couple weeks, so I'll sit with you for an hour, 4 classes, an hour at a time. But every week I have a 5 to 10 minute video with some little tidbit tip that is free to you and to your friends and to your family. So please like, share, follow me on all of my social media. That's Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube is where I house all of my tutorial videos. So please do that. And then see me tomorrow at 10 a.m. as we talk about what are these stories that other people tell us and how are those impacting us, and how do we really change that for ourselves with self-empowered choices. All right, everybody, have a great rest of your weekend.